During dinner, my son-in-law threw a glass at my face because I refused to pour him another drink. It hit the wall beside me and shattered, shards sliding down the wallpaper like tiny falling stars. For a second, no one breathed. Elena froze mid-reach, her hands trembling above her plate. The sound of whiskey dripping from the wall was louder than anything else in the room. Servants must obey, Leroy slurred, swaying in his chair, eyes burning with a drunk kind of pride. You used to know your place, old man. Now you just sit there like you own the world. I didn't answer. I'd learned long ago that silence, in the right hands, can be sharper than words. I simply folded my napkin, placed it beside my plate, and looked at him, not with anger, but with something that made him shift uncomfortably in his seat. The table between us was the same one my wife had chosen 30 years ago, oak polished smooth from countless family dinners, birthdays, and holidays. Now, the same table felt foreign, a battlefield of pride and liquor. 8 months. That's how long it had been since they'd moved in, just until they got back on their feet. 8 months of late-night arguments behind closed doors. 8 months of Leroy's arrogance slowly spilling into every room of my house. Elena's voice broke through the silence, barely more than a whisper. Please, both of you, let's not do this again. Her eyes darted between us, desperate for peace that neither of us could give. But I stayed still, watching Leroy lift the bottle again, his hand unsteady. You think you're better than me, don't you? He muttered. Retired judge, wise old Coulson, everyone's moral compass. You've never worked a real job in your life. That was when I saw it. The small flash of something beneath his bravado, fear, the kind that hides under arrogance. He didn't hate me because of what I said. He hated me because of what I represented, everything he could never become. Go on, he sneered. Say something, old man. I didn't. I stood up, walked to the counter, and took the bottle from his hand. He laughed, mocking. Oh, come on, pour me another. Don't act like you're my boss. I looked at the label for a moment, then at him. Enough, I said quietly. You've already had too much of everything. That's when he threw the glass. And that's when I decided, tomorrow morning, he'd learn what happens when a man mistakes kindness for weakness. It hadn't always been like this. When Elena first called 8 months ago, her voice was small, breaking between words. Dad, can we stay with you for a little while? Just until Leroy finds something stable again. Of course I said yes. She was my only child, the one who still visited every Sunday, who still brought flowers for her mother's grave. The day they arrived, rain followed them, boxes damp from the downpour, Leroy's laughter echoing too loudly as if to hide his unease. He shook my hand with that salesman's grip, firm but hollow, and called me sir, like it was a joke. For the first few weeks I told myself things would smooth out. Elena cooked dinners, filled the house with the smell of rosemary and garlic again. She hummed softly while washing dishes, the same tune her mother used to sing. Leroy helped fix the gutters, mowed the lawn once, and talked about new business leads that never turned into anything real. But comfort slowly became entitlement. He began leaving his shoes by the fireplace, his jacket over my chair, his cigarette butts in the planter my wife once tended. One night, I found him sitting in my study, my wife's picture frame face down on the desk, a glass of whiskey beside it. Nice collection you've got here, he said, gesturing to the shelves of law journals and case files. Must be easy to lecture people about. Discipline when you've got a pension. Cushioning your ego. I told him the study was off limits. He smirked, took another sip, and said, Oh, come on, Coulson. We're family now. Lighten up. I didn't argue. I simply turned off the lamp and said, Even family should know where the line is. He didn't like that. From that night on, he made small moves, testing, pushing. Elena, gentle as she was, tried to make peace. He's just stressed, Dad. He lost a lot when he got fired. But stress doesn't excuse disrespect. It reveals it. The worst part wasn't his words. It was watching Elena shrink. She started speaking less at dinner. Her laughter faded into polite smiles. She apologized for things that weren't her fault. Once, I caught her quietly wiping the edge of the table where he had spilled his drink. Before I could even mention it, that's when I knew. My daughter was walking on glass every day, afraid of what might break next. I wanted to protect her, but she'd built walls of excuses around him. He's changing, Dad, she'd say, hopeful eyes hiding exhaustion. He just needs time. Time. That word used to mean healing. But under my roof, time had started to rot. The night of the glass, it wasn't just about whiskey. It was about every moment I'd swallowed my pride for her peace. Every insult I let pass for the sake of quiet dinners. Every time I let a man forget that kindness is not weakness. That night, when he threw the glass, I didn't just see rage, I saw the end of patience. And patience, when it ends in silence, can be more dangerous than fury. By the time the clock struck 10, the house had fallen into that kind of silence. That hums under pressure, the kind. Right before something gives way, Elena was in the kitchen, rinsing dishes she hadn't eaten from, pretending not to hear the muttered curses from the dining room. The smell of whiskey and shame hung in the air. Leroy slouched back in his chair, staring at me with bloodshot eyes. The dim light from the chandelier carved harsh shadows across his face. He swirled what was left in his glass, then smirked. "You know, Coulson, I think I finally figured you out." I didn't answer. I was too tired for whatever discovery he thought he'd made. He leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice low and bitter. "You walk around here like some kind of king. This isn't your courtroom, old man. It's my home too now. I live here. I eat here. I sleep here with your daughter. Maybe it's time you got used to that." The words landed like nails driven into wood, slow and deliberate. Elena froze in the doorway, dish towel in hand. Her lips parted as if to say something, but no sound came out. "Leroy," she said finally, soft and broken. "That's enough." But it wasn't. He stood, glass still in hand, and walked toward me with that uneven swagger drunks believe looks like confidence. "You think you're better than me because you used to wear a robe and sit behind a desk? Because you made people afraid with your rules and your little speeches?" His voice cracked as he laughed. "Well, I'm not afraid of you." "I never asked you to be," I said quietly. He stopped. The steadiness in my tone seemed to irritate him even more. "You talk down to me," he said, stepping closer. "Every word that comes out of your mouth is soaked in judgment. You think I don't notice? You think I don't see the way you look at me?" "I see the way you look at yourself," I replied. "That's enough to tell me everything." His jaw tightened. For a brief second, I saw the boy behind the bluster, the one who thought success meant control, who mistook loudness for power. Then the glass in his hand tilted. He poured the last of the whiskey into his mouth, swallowed and whispered, "Servants must obey." Elena gasped. "Leroy, stop!" The glass flew before she finished the sentence, spinning, catching the light, and shattered against the wall beside me. Elena screamed. The dog barked from the hallway, but I didn't move. I stood there, perfectly still, my heart steady, my eyes locked on him. The silence after was heavier than the sound of the crash. He stared back at me, chest heaving, waiting for me to explode, to finally lose my temper, to give him the reaction he wanted. But I didn't. I simply picked up my napkin again, folded it neatly, and set it on the table. Elena was crying now, trembling hands on her face. "You should go upstairs," I told her softly. "Get some rest." "Dad, please." She hesitated, then obeyed, her steps shaky as she disappeared down the hallway. Leroy chuckled, a mean sound that didn't quite hide his uncertainty. "That's it? No lecture? No threat?" I met his gaze, calm and unblinking. "No," I said. "You've already told me who you are. Tomorrow morning, you'll understand who I am." He frowned, trying to make sense of the words through the haze of alcohol. But I didn't wait for him to. I turned and left the room, my footsteps slow, deliberate, echoing against the wooden floor. Upstairs, I could hear Elena crying softly. Downstairs, Leroy poured himself another drink. I walked into my study and closed the door behind me. On the desk sat my wife's photograph, the one he'd once turned face down. I set it upright again, dusted the frame, and whispered, "Tomorrow, love." Just one more lesson to teach. That night, sleep stayed far from me, not because of anger. I'd walked past that long ago, but because of clarity. The house creaked with the sounds of its age. The pipes hummed. The grandfather clock ticked, like a metronome marking the seconds of something inevitable. Downstairs, I could still hear the faint clink of a bottle against glass. Leroy's rhythm of cowardice. I sat in my study, surrounded by memories and quiet judgment. The bookshelves, the oak desk, the dust dancing in the lamp's yellow glow, all of it seemed to lean in, waiting for me to decide. On the table lay an old leather briefcase, one I hadn't opened in years. Inside, neatly kept beneath a folded court robe, were letters, documents, and records I'd once thought I'd never use again. But life has a way of circling back when lessons go unlearned. I took out a folder marked Property Rose Hill Estate. That house wasn't just a home. It was my late wife's pride, the last piece of her inheritance she'd wanted our daughter to keep, safe and clean. And now a drunk man with an ego problem was pacing its floors and spilling liquor where she once prayed. Not for long. I made a few calls, quiet ones, deliberate ones. First to an old friend at the bank, then to another who still worked in real estate, and finally to a third, a quiet man in his 70s, who'd been a notary for half the town's legal documents. Each conversation was short, polite, and ended the same way. "It's good to hear your voice again, Colson. I'll take care of it first thing in the morning." By the time the last call ended, the night was deep and heavy, the kind of dark that presses against the window panes like it wants to listen. I took my wife's photograph from the desk again and set it beside the paperwork. "You always told me not to raise my voice when I'm right," I whispered. "Well, I won't." From upstairs came a faint sob. Elena, restless in her room. She was my only daughter, my only reason to stay quiet for as long as I did. But I couldn't let her drown in someone else's misery. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a ring, my wife's ring, simple, gold with her initials carved on the inside. I slipped it into my pocket. Tomorrow I would give it to Elena again, not as a token of the past, but as a reminder that strength runs in our bloodline. At 3:30, I finally stood and walked to the window. The moon was thin and sharp, hanging above the sleeping town like a silver blade. Outside, the wind brushed against the tall hedges my wife once trimmed herself. I could almost see her there, soft hands, gentle eyes, laughing about how discipline starts in the garden. She'd hate what the house had become. I turned away from the window, blew out the lamp, and let the darkness fold around me. But before I left the study, I paused at the door and looked back once. "Tomorrow," I said softly, "the house goes quiet again, my way." When morning finally crept through the curtains, it brought more than sunlight. It brought a reckoning. Morning arrived like an uninvited guest, slow, heavy, and filled with unfinished business. The golden light spilled across the dining room table, still littered with the debris of last night's storm, empty glasses, half-eaten bread, and a whiskey bottle lying on its side like a fallen soldier. Leroy groaned from the couch, where he'd passed out, one shoe off, tie wrapped around his wrist. His snoring cut through the silence, harsh and careless. Elena stood by the sink, pale and quiet, staring out the window with eyes swollen from crying. She didn't notice me come in at first. "Morning, sweetheart," I said softly, setting down a tray with breakfast, 2 cups of coffee and toast. She flinched at my voice, then forced a smile that broke my heart. "Dad, I'm sorry about last night."
He didn't mean...
I raised a hand gently. "Don't defend a man who treats you like an audience to his failures." She lowered her gaze. Silence filled the space between us again. I looked toward Leroy. "How long will he sleep?" "Until noon, probably. He said some awful things." I tried to stop him. "I know," I said. "And now it's time he learns the cost of forgetting where he stands." I walked past her, every step calm, deliberate, as if rehearsed. The smell of stale alcohol lingered sharp and sour. On the sideboard, I'd placed a small stack of documents tied neatly with a ribbon, the ones from last night. I untied them slowly, letting each paper slide free like a whisper of finality. At the very top was a single sheet, the deed transfer notice. The house no longer belonged to me. It now stood under Elena's name, solely hers. Signed, notarized, and sealed by Dawn. When she realized what she was looking at, her lips parted in disbelief. "Dad, what did you—" "This home," I said quietly, "was never meant to be a battlefield. It's yours now, every brick, every window. I made sure of it." Her hand trembled as she touched the document. "But why?" "Because I've watched him strip you of your peace while—" I stayed silent out of love. That silence ends today. As if on cue, Leroy stirred. He sat up, rubbing his temples, hair a mess, his voice hoarse. "What's all the talking about?" He blinked, squinting at the light, and then at me. "Oh, you're still here, old man." Elena gasped, but I didn't flinch. I merely stepped closer, folded the papers neatly, and placed them on the coffee table in front of him. "Good morning, Leroy," I said, calm as still water. He frowned, his hangover twisting into irritation. "Don't start your lectures. I'm not in the mood." I leaned slightly forward. "Then I'll keep it short. As of this morning, this house belongs to your wife. Only her name is on it. You have no claim here. Not a wall, not a floorboard." For a moment the room was silent except for the ticking clock. Then confusion flickered across his face, followed by disbelief. What kind of joke is that? He spat, snatching the papers. His eyes scanned the bold stamps and signatures. Real, legal, irreversible. His jaw slackened. Elena looked away. You did this behind my back? He barked at her. You let your father. She didn't let me, I interrupted. I did it because she deserves safety. And you? I paused, letting my gaze meet his squarely. Deserve a reminder that respect cannot be poured into a glass. He slammed the papers down, the sound echoing through the quiet room. You can't just... Oh, I can, I said softly. And I have. The front door creaked open. My old friend, the notary, stepped inside. Morning, Coulson. I brought the finalized copies you requested. Leroy froze. Reality settled on him like cold water. Elena's tears fell silently as she clutched the edge of the table. Relief, shock, and heartbreak tangled together. I turned to her gently. He'll leave today. You don't need to raise your voice. The papers will speak for you. Leroy stood, fists clenched, but words caught in his throat. He looked at me, and for the first time since he'd entered my home, I saw fear in his eyes. You planned this, he said bitterly. I nodded once. Last night, while you drank away your dignity. I turned toward the window, sunlight painting the floor with gold. Now finish your coffee before you go. You'll need the strength to find another roof. And with that, I left the room, not triumphant, not vengeful, but free. For the first time in months, the house felt quiet again, peaceful, like it was breathing again. Upstairs, my wife's photo caught the morning light. Her smile seemed almost alive, proud, whispering, "You did the right thing." For a while, no one spoke. The air in the house felt heavy, as if it were holding its breath, waiting to see who would make the next move. Leroy's hand trembled slightly as he refilled his glass. But this time there was no whiskey inside, only water. Even that he spilled. The sharp clink of the glass against the table was the only sound left in the room. He looked smaller somehow, the swagger gone, his shoulders caved in. You can't just throw me out, he muttered finally, his voice dry and broken. I don't have anywhere else to go. I studied him for a long moment. Then maybe, I said quietly, you'll finally understand what it feels like to depend on someone else's mercy. He looked up at me, eyes red from drink and pride. You think you're better than me, old man? No, I replied softly. I just never forgot who raised me, or who I raised. Elena stood frozen by the staircase. Her hands were clasped together, tears streaming down her cheeks, but this time, not out of fear. There was something else in her eyes, something stronger. Dad, she said in a trembling voice, what happens now? Now, I said, turning toward her, you decide what kind of life you want to live. One ruled by fear, or by respect. Leroy pushed himself up from the chair, staggering slightly. This isn't over, he snapped. You'll regret this. But there was no power in his tone, only desperation. I watched him gather his jacket, his movements jerky and uncertain. He glanced at Elena, maybe hoping for her to intervene. But she didn't move. Instead, she said, her voice breaking but firm, Leroy, please go. He froze. For a brief second, I saw him realize what he'd lost. Not a house, not material comfort, but her, the woman who had stood by him even when he didn't deserve it. He looked at her, at me, then around the room, the walls that had heard his shouting, the table he'd slammed his glass against, the memories he'd poisoned. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came. Finally, he just grabbed his keys and stumbled toward the door. When it shut behind him, the echo lingered, a dull thud that carried both an ending and a beginning. Elena let out a sob, then pressed her hands to her face. I crossed the room slowly, gently placing a hand on her shoulder. It's all right now, I whispered. The storm's over. She turned to me, her eyes full of guilt. I should have left sooner. I thought he'd change. I nodded. Love makes fools of all of us. But wisdom comes when pain teaches what comfort never could. She rested her head against my chest like she used to when she was a child. I held her, feeling her heartbeat steady again. Outside, birds began to sing, tentative, cautious notes of morning peace. Hours passed in quiet recovery. We cleaned the dining room together, sweeping away glass shards and empty bottles. Each broken piece that clinked into the trash felt symbolic. A piece of pain removed. Piece by piece. Later, as sunlight filtered in through the curtains, I brewed fresh coffee. Elena sat at the kitchen table, calm now, hands wrapped around the warm mug. Dad, she said softly, what you did. giving me the house. That was more than I could ever ask for. I smiled faintly. It wasn't a gift, Elena. It was a promise. That you'd never have to earn respect from someone who doesn't understand its worth. She nodded, and a quiet strength settled in her expression. A daughter finally remembering who she came from. As the day wore on, the house began to breathe again. No tension, no anger, just the creak of old wood, the hum of the fridge, the sound of home returning to peace. I went to my study, where sunlight fell across my wife's photograph on the desk. She was smiling, that same calm, knowing smile she always had when she believed I'd find a way to fix what was broken. Well, my love, I murmured, it's fixed. Not perfect, but fixed. I looked out the window, the garden outside catching the last of the afternoon light. Then, just as I was about to close the blinds, I saw him, Leroy, standing at the end of the driveway beside his car. He wasn't yelling this time. He wasn't even moving, just standing there, watching the house. For a long minute I said nothing. Neither did he. Then he turned, got into his car, and drove away. Not a word, not a backward glance. Just gone. And as the sound of his engine faded down the road, a quiet settled over everything, heavy at first, then light, freeing. I exhaled slowly, closing my eyes. For the first time in a long time, the silence didn't feel empty. It felt earned. A week passed. The house had changed, in ways that words couldn't describe. Not in furniture or color, but in air. It finally felt alive again. The mornings were quiet, but not the uncomfortable kind. Just peaceful. Birds sang outside the kitchen window. The smell of coffee lingered longer. The clatter of dishes carried warmth instead of tension. And Elena, she smiled again. Not the practiced smile she'd worn for months, but the kind that reached her eyes. Every morning, she'd step out to the garden barefoot, watering the plants her mother once loved. Sometimes she'd talk to them like old friends. I'd watch from the porch, coffee in hand, and think to myself, she's healing. The neighbors stopped by one afternoon, curious after Leroy's abrupt disappearance. I gave them polite, vague answers. He needed time to get himself together, I said. What I didn't add was time and distance. Elena never spoke his name again. She didn't have to. The silence between us carried an unspoken agreement. That chapter was closed. But late one evening, as we sat together in the living room, she asked quietly, "Do you think people like him ever realize what they've lost?" I thought about that for a long time before answering. They realize, I said finally. But only after they've lost the one thing they can't buy back: respect. She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening in the firelight. Then I guess he's learned his lesson, she murmured. Maybe, I replied, but some lessons come too late to matter. She smiled faintly, a mixture of sadness and peace, then stood to kiss my forehead. Good night, Dad. After she went upstairs, I sat alone for a while, staring at the dying fire. The clock ticked steadily on the mantel, each sound gentle, rhythmic, like the heartbeat of the home itself. I thought about my years as a prosecutor, all the faces I'd seen, men who thought power meant dominance, that fear equaled respect. And now, here in my twilight years, I'd realized something simpler. True power isn't in the voice that shouts. It's in the one that stays silent and still wins. Outside, a car slowed near the driveway. My instinct stiffened, but it didn't stop. It just drove by. Still, I stood and drew the curtains aside, peering into the night. The moon hung high, calm and indifferent. Peace, it seemed, had decided to stay. I turned off the lamp, letting the fire burn to embers. My wife's portrait caught the faint light, her eyes soft and kind. I whispered to her, "You'd be proud of her, you know." She found her voice again. For a moment, I could almost hear her laughter, the same gentle laugh that once filled these halls. I made my way upstairs slowly. Elena's door was half open. She was already asleep. I paused, watching her breathe, peaceful for the first time in years. Then I closed my own door, the hinges sighing softly. Before I turned off the light, I glanced once more at the small box on my nightstand. Inside it, the old house keys. I smiled. Keys I no longer needed, because this house wasn't mine anymore. It belonged to her, to peace, to new beginnings, to everything my wife and I had ever hoped our daughter would have. And as I lay down, the night wrapped around me like an old friend. Some men measure their legacy in wealth, others in monuments. But me? Mine was quieter. A daughter's safety, a home reclaimed, and the simple, unspoken victory of knowing respect once lost can be taken back without raising your voice. The fire downstairs went out, leaving only the soft hum of the night. And for the first time in a long, long while, Coulson slept in peace.